Today, we're going to build a skyscraper, but not with steel and glass. Nope, we're going to use something way more powerful: human trust. We're about to take a journey through the history of finance, and I promise this isn't some dry story about numbers. It's a deeply human tale about how we've built value, one promise at a time. So let's just start with a really big question right out of the gate. What if this entire sprawling financial system, from the coins in your pocket to the supercomputers trading stocks, isn't really about money at all? What if, when you strip it all away, it's just about promises? To figure that out, we're going to go on a journey, kind of like climbing that skyscraper, floor by floor. We'll start at the very foundation, the psychology of it all. Then we'll build our way up from trading physical stuff to using paper, and finally, to the wild, purely abstract ideas that run our world today.
Okay, first things first. Before we can even get into money, we have to lay the groundwork. We've got to talk about the belief system that makes any of this possible in the first place.
It all boils down to this one word: credit. It actually comes from the Latin word credere, which means to believe, and that is not a coincidence. Think about it. Every single loan, every investment, every transaction is an act of faith. It's a belief that a promise we make today is actually going to be kept tomorrow. This belief, this is the bedrock of the entire skyscraper we're building.
So, with that foundation of belief firmly in place, let's head up to the first floor. Let's see how humanity tackled its very first major economic headache. How to trade things without it being a total mess.
See, the original system, barter, was a nightmare. It had this huge flaw that economists have a fancy name for: the double coincidence of wants. It just means that for a trade to work, I have to want what you have, and at the same time, you have to want what I have. So if I have a chicken and I want shoes, but the shoemaker wants bread, we're stuck. Nothing happens. It's just wildly inefficient.
To get around this, early societies got really, really creative. They came up with commodity money, basically using things that were already valuable on their own. Roman soldiers, for instance, were paid in salt. That's actually where we get the word salary. In Mesoamerica, they used cocoa beans. And get this, on the island of Yap, they used these giant carved stones as money. They were so heavy, they never moved them. They just kept track of who owned which one. So you can see this natural evolution taking place. We go from clunky, inefficient barter to using commodities, which is better but still kind of bulky. That logically leads to precious metals like gold and silver. They're easy to carry, they last forever, and they're rare. But there was still a problem. Every single time you wanted to trade, you had to weigh the metal and check if it was pure. It was a hassle. Finance needed one more leap. And here it is. Around 600 BC, in a kingdom called Lydia, it's in modern-day Turkey, they had a genius idea. Let's just stamp the metal. That little stamp was the king's promise. It was his guarantee of the weight and the purity. All of a sudden, you didn't need scales anymore. You just had to trust the promise stamped on that coin. And because people did, trade absolutely exploded. All right, let's head up to the next floor of our building. Trusting a stamp on a piece of metal was a huge step. But what happens when the promise leaves the metal behind completely and becomes just a piece of paper? Well, this next big idea came from a pretty unexpected source: the Knights Templar. They created this incredible network of trust that stretched across entire continents. A pilgrim could drop off their gold in, say, France, and travel all the way to Jerusalem carrying nothing but a coded letter, a written promise, and when they got there, they could cash it in. For its time, this was mind-blowingly advanced. Then, during the Renaissance, came this quiet little innovation that changed everything. An Italian friar named Luca Pacioli laid out the system of double-entry bookkeeping. Now, for the very first time, merchants had a super clear, logical way to track their whole complicated web of promises, all their assets, all their debts. You could say it was the operating system for modern capitalism. And all of this, these paper promises, this better accounting, it all leads us to this moment, in 1602, with the creation of the first modern stock exchange in Amsterdam. For the very first time, you could buy and sell shares in a company. Literally, you were trading paper promises for a piece of a company's future profits. The promise itself had become the product. But this new power came with a dark side, a twin. On the one hand, you had the Dutch East India Company, which created staggering long-term value for centuries. But on the other hand, just a few decades later, in the exact same city, you had tulipomania. People got so caught up in speculating on the future price of tulip bulbs that for a brief moment, a single bulb was worth more than a fancy house. This is the essential tension of finance, right? The promise of creating real value versus the peril of short-term speculative greed.
And that brings us to the top floor, the penthouse of our architecture of value. This is where the promise finally completely cuts itself loose from any physical object and becomes a pure, abstract idea.
For most of modern history, money was still basically a receipt for a real thing, usually gold. Under systems like the gold standard, or later Bretton Woods, you could, at least in theory, walk into a bank with your paper money and demand a fixed amount of gold in return. But that all changed on one very specific day, August 15th, 1971.
With what became known as the Nixon shock, the final chain connecting money to the physical world was just severed. Money was no longer a claim on an asset. It became what we call fiat money, from the Latin for let it be done. Its value now comes from one place and one place only, our collective promise, our shared belief in the stability of the government that prints it. This final act of abstraction is what unlocked the wild financial world we live in today, a world of high-frequency trading where algorithms make millions of promises every second, a world of complex derivatives, which are literally promises built on top of other promises. The architecture became incredibly powerful and almost unbelievably complex. But that level of abstraction also carries enormous risk. The 2008 financial crisis was just a brutal, painful lesson in what happens when this skyscraper of promises gets so tall, so layered, that we lose sight of the actual value, or the lack of value, at its foundation. The whole building started to shake. So, here we are. We started with a simple belief between two people. And from that, we have built this towering, global structure of promises. Today, we're standing on the edge of a new kind of promise, one that's digital, decentralized, and programmable. The question for all of us now is, after climbing this high, what new architecture will we dare to build next?